I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet tonight on Gadigal land. The Gadigal people have a long and enduring connection to the land, sea and sky of the Sydney area, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and warmly welcome any First Nations people with us tonight. Good evening, my name is Mel Flyte. I'm the Collections Discovery Assistant with the Caroline Simpson Library. Tonight's event coincides with our current library display, which celebrates the 20th anniversary of the Caroline Simpson Library. Prior to 2004, the Library and Research Collection, established in 1984, had existed initially as a resource for the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, and then as a specialist library focused on the history of the home, interiors and gardens of New South Wales since first contact. After the death of Caroline Simpson OAM in 2003, her children donated her collection of furniture, art, objects and books to the Historic Houses Trust, now Museums of History New South Wales, in 2004, along with a generous bequest, the largest cultural gift ever received. In honour of Caroline's lifelong passion for history and heritage, the library was renamed in her honour, and her art and book collection found a new home here. The current display is drawn from Caroline's personal collection of material relating to the journey of Rose de Freycinet, 1817 to 1820. This evening we'll have the chance to view rare material from the collection, along with additional material from the State Archives collection. But to begin, we'll be hearing from my guest, Suzanne Falkiner. Suzanne is a Sydney writer. After growing up on a sheep station in central western New South Wales, she spent several years travelling in Asia, Europe and South America, and living in Paris, Umbria and New York. Suzanne is the author of 13 books, including Mick, A Life of Randolph Stow, which was shortlisted for several biography awards. It was while researching this book that she discovered the story of Rose de Freycinet as she walked on a remote beach at Shark Bay in Western Australia. She has always had a fondness for beachcombing in distant places, for which biographical research provides a wonderful excuse. Suzanne is author of the 2022 biography of Rose de Freycinet, and we are delighted that she is joining us tonight to share her insights about this fascinating woman. Welcome, Suzanne, and thank you so much. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Right. Rose de Freycinet, as you know, was the first woman to sail around the world and leave a written account of her journey. She was probably also the first French woman to describe a visit to the British settlement at Sydney Cove. Her husband, Louis, a skilled cartographer, had already visited with Nicolas Baudin's expedition in 1802, and it was this rather controversial voyage that made him determined to return. I first learned of this story from a notice board on a beach at Shark Bay, and it was the incongruous image of a Jane Austen-like figure, complete with Empire Line gown and sunbonnet, strolling along these shores before any European settlement was set in Western Australia. And that led me to follow up Rose's story. I'd been driving north from Geraldton on a different research trip, and I hadn't seen another vehicle all day on a long straight highway with nothing but the desert on one side and the Indian Ocean on the other. And so I thought I'd take a break and have a walk on the beach. So I drove down this little side road and parked my little white rental car in the blazing sun and went down to the water. But as I looked up this empty coastline, almost identical in both directions, the immensity of the arid landscape made me feel as if I was the only person in the world. I'd read on this one of those instructive parks and wildlife notice boards that on 16th of September 1818, a young French woman had landed a little further up the peninsula after her husband's matelots had carried her ashore from a longboat stranded on the sandbanks. She and her husband had sat on a sandstone outcrop and had eaten some oysters gathered from nearby. Certainly, All those that I have eaten in Paris, at table and at my ease, did not seem to me as good as these, that I ate sitting on a rock, my glass and my plate on the sand, she wrote to her mother. And so I tried to imagine this 23-year-old girl, more used to the crowded streets of the left bank in Paris, walking on this same lonely beach. If the landscape seemed unearthly to me, I thought, how must it have seemed to her? Rose was a near contemporary of Jane Austen, and her life in some ways parallels the plot of the novel Persuasion, which was published in 1817, the same year that Rose embarked on her sea journey. Rose de Freycinet, a young naval officer, had returned from the Napoleonic Wars, ready to find a bride. He chose Rose, the genteel daughter of a widowed schoolteacher, without fortune or connections. And then, a few years later, they were so deeply in love that when Louis was awarded his coveted scientific expedition to the South Seas, they couldn't bear to be parted. So Rose dressed herself in a boy's clothing and hid on board his ship. But let's return for a moment to Shark Bay, Rose's first stopover without a colonial settlement. Here, in her pretty bonnet and gown, she encountered a hunting party of Malgana men, sauvage, or wild people, as they call the indigenous inhabitants. These Malgana men were entirely naked, very black, and armed with long, dangerous-looking spears. One wonders who was more astonished. Rose was terrified, she wrote in her journal, which was addressed to a young school friend, Caroline, back in France. We saw on the top of the sandhills several figures whom we at first took to be some of our men who had gone hunting. They threatened us and made signs to us to return to the ship. It was then that I remembered what you said to me in one of your letters in Toulon, that I would hide myself behind Louis's coattails at the first sight of them. In truth, I confess I was very afraid and would willingly have hidden myself. Later, when they'd set up a campsite on shore, the French visitors had another encounter when more men again appeared on the sandhills behind them. Some of the sailors picked up their guns, but agreed not to fire except as a last resort. But instead of a band of fierce warriors, they faced a group who looked just as worried as they were. This image by the ship's artist Jacques Arago shows that some trading had begun. An officer is handing over a gift of some large white cotton handkerchiefs, which one of the local men cautiously accepts on the tip of his spear, not wanting to get too close. Arago, who had always carried around some magic trips and novelties to entertain the people he painted, is playing a pair of castanets, and some of the indigenous men are dancing to it. And here you can see the whole camp, drawn by another French artist, Alphonse Pellion. Barefoot sailors carry buckets of seawater to the two stills that they use to produce fresh water, while others chop wood and tend to cooking pots on an open fire. To the left are some canvas shelters, with washing hung out to dry in front, and a dozen long-barreled muskets neatly stacked. On the right is Louis's private tent, with the white Bourbon flag flying on top. Louis stands outside at his scientific work table in full uniform, while Rose sits reading a book to a small Mauritian boy. In the foreground, some officers examine a small shark, while more sailors carry baskets of oysters from the rocks. And here's another illustration of the same scene, also drawn by Pellion. And this one was intended for the official records. And if you're sharp-eyed, you'll notice a significant difference. Not only is the untidy clothesline and the more loose-looking sailors missing, but so is Rose de Freycinet and the small boy. This is, of course, because officially she was not there. It was strictly against naval regulations for Louis to take his wife on board. And while he was usually a punctilious officer, he had agreed when Rose had persuaded him to take her with him. Some of these surviving parallel versions ended up in the Freycinet family's private collection. Until recently, little was known of Rose's background beyond the date and place of her birth. I was lucky enough to have an old French friend from my youth who was able to organise to investigate some local village records for me. This is an early postcard of Saint-Julien-de-Sault in Burgundy, where Rose Pinon was born on 29th of September 1794. This seemed something of a mystery to me, as her family had apparently lived in Paris. But at this stage of the French Revolution, they may have been hiding out here due to their royalist connections. Many of Rose's father, Etienne Pinon's relatives were clockmakers, jewellers, armourers and artists to the Bourbon royal family. And at this date, anyone suspected of not being loyal to the revolution could be summarily executed. Rose's mother, Jeanne Tauzin, was the daughter of a carriage maker. Widowed early, she earned a living by establishing a boarding school for young ladies, where foreign students could learn the French language and French manners. So, while Rose grew up in relative poverty, she had also acquired an excellent education. Madame Pinon, on her death in 1822, left behind a collection of 400 books, some of them in English, Italian, and Spanish. Oh, what have I done? Press the wrong button. Where? That's it, thank you. Technologically illiterate. Louis de Freycinet, in contrast, came from a well-established family with a large estate near Montélimar in southern France. Here he is in his mid-20s, not long after his voyage with Nicolas Baudin. While 15 years older than Rose, he still looks quite boyish, with his important gold lieutenant's epaulettes and his uniform collar nearly enveloping his ears. Privately tutored at home, he grew up with a strong interest in natural history and science, and he was an avid reader with a great love of poetry and music, all interests that he shared with Rose. In preparation for the voyage, he assembled a ship's library of 2,000 books, scientific works and narratives of earlier voyages, including a contemporary account in English of the colony at Port Jackson. So, when Louis married 19-year-old Rose in June 1814 at Montmartre, she was probably regarded as having made a very good match. Louis and his brothers grew up at the Château de Freycinet, adjoining the village of Saulce-sur-Rhône. Walled grounds and a tree-lined driveway led to a substantial three-story stone house set among orchards and forests, with a steep tiled roof and attic rooms for servants. Louis de Freycinet had first gone to sea as a midshipman at the age of 14, fighting in several sea battles against the British before embarking at 21 with the Baudin voyage. Back in France, he returned to active duty, but in 1805 was invalided ashore, ill and exhausted, possibly with tropical diseases, to work in Paris on the Baudin expedition's maps. At this stage, Rose was an 11-year-old schoolgirl, still at her mother's school. But sometime in the following years they met and became engaged, and were married a week after Napoleon was exiled to Elba. Just 3 years later, under the new Restoration regime, Louis was awarded his longed-for scientific expedition. On the 16th of September 1817, the night before the Uranie was due to sail, Rose left her lodgings in the fashionable Rue Saint-Roch in Toulon, where she'd been living with Louis for several months before his departure. Apparently she was intending to take the midnight coach for Marseille, en route back to the Rose de Freycinet. Instead, she hid in the house of a friend in a cluster of narrow streets near the harbour. At midnight, with her hair cut short and disguised as a boy, Louis rowed her out to the ship, where she hid in his cabin. When the French authorities discovered her disappearance, there was a scandal in all the newspapers. Early in his preparations for the voyage, Louis had surreptitiously fitted out his quarters so that his wife would have some private space to live in. The Uranie was about a tennis court and a half in length, with cramped lower decks, less than head height. And here she would live for 3 years, alone as a woman among 120 men. The ships of the day were dangerous and unhealthy places, where hygiene and diet were poor, and diseases such as cholera, smallpox, and dysentery spread quickly. Apart from the perils of storm, shipwreck, and attack by pirates, what would happen if she became pregnant? But on the other hand, for anyone who's ever wanted to run away to sea, this is where the great adventure began. After visiting Gibraltar and Tenerife, the Uranie called in at Rio de Janeiro. Rose wrote about the strange and exotic landscape she saw and the beautiful new flowers and birds. In Brazil, she also had her first experiences of slavery and other confronting customs. Then came Cape Town and Mauritius and Réunion in the Indian Ocean. This is how Rose made her social calls during her stay in Mauritius. After the long crossing to Shark Bay, the Uranie turned north to Kupang in Timor, and then Dili, then a small Portuguese settlement. When the Portuguese governor learned that Rose was on board, he organised a formal reception for her, which also gave Jacques Arago an opportunity for fun. Rose, without the finery needed for such a grand occasion, dressed herself as best she could, she wrote to her mother, and decorated her bonnet with feathers. As 6 cannons roared out a salute, she took Louis's arm and carefully descended the gangplank from the longboat in front of a large crowd. As she stepped ashore, the governor guided her under the shade of a huge parasol carried by a Timorese slave. Both Pellion and Arago created images of this scene. In Arago's version, we see Rose, ostrich plumes nodding gracefully, stepping off hand in hand with Louis to greet the governor, while, I don't know if you could see it, but behind him an officer falls head over turkey into the longboat with his shining boots pointing skyward. Unsurprisingly, this image was also not included in the official record. Pellion's version, in Pellion's version, Louis, a solitary and dignified figure, walks down the plank alone. But Pellion had also made a draft that includes Rose, and you can see that in this collection later. Further north, in the Pacific, among a myriad of tiny islands, Rose wrote in her journal, "I sometimes remember that my mother wrote to me when I was still in Toulon, that a map of Paris and its surrounds was enough at first for her to find each of the places where we had lived, and then afterwards we needed a map of France, and finally only a map of the world would she be able to follow us. Now, a very detailed map of Oceania, if there is such a thing, would be needed to know where we are." Here in the Papuan Islands, Rose lived among people reputed to be cannibals and among the handsome people of the Mariana Islands. So, where most male accounts would include here an exotic picture of bare-breasted Islander women dancing, I've included this one. I think it's also by Jacques Arago, and as it's International Women's Day, I've included it for the women among us. In October 1819, in eastern Samoa, Rose noted in her journal that they had discovered an isolated atoll unmarked in their maps. Rose was pleased and proud, she wrote to Madame Pinon, that Louis had named it Ile Rose. Louis himself noted more enigmatically that he'd named it for someone extremely dear to me. This was the only allusion to Rose in his entire account of the expedition. Another long sea passage, and they reached Sydney Harbour in mid-November 1819. In the darkness, the Uranie anchored in Neutral Bay, directly opposite Sydney Cove. Next morning, Rose got up at daybreak and went on deck to find herself in full view of the settlement across the water. Wishing to enjoy her surprise, she wrote, "That wretch of a Louis hadn't told me what to expect." Imagine then my astonishment to find myself quite close to a town, and a town with houses built in the European style. It is 18 months since I saw anything of the kind, and it was a very great pleasure to me. So here is Port Jackson, as Rose might have seen it from Observatory Hill. John Piper, the harbour master, came on board early, bringing with him, along with eagerly awaited letters from France, some fresh fruit, new-laid eggs and milk for their breakfast, which were things they hadn't seen for many months. After this, things didn't go quite so well. Louis rented a house near Lower Fort Street, and Rose went ashore and moved in. The house was conveniently close to the waterfront and to the Dawes Point Observatory, but the rocks were already a less than salubrious area, with narrow footways and crowded dwellings. The first night, as they slept upstairs, a convict crept in and stole all their crested silverware and table linen. This is the police notice from the Sydney Gazette, dated 24 November 1819, listing the stolen items and offering a generous reward for their return. Rose wrote philosophically, "It would be as surprising not to find thieves here as not to meet Parisians in Paris or the English in London." While Louis reprovisioned and repaired his ship, Rose had parties and balls to attend and new friendships to make. But Louis had also diplomatic aspects to consider. On his last arrival with Baudin, neither the French nor the English knew whether their countries were still at war with each other, and France and England had again been fighting in the interim. Having triumphed 5 years earlier at Waterloo, the British at Port Jackson could afford to be gracious, but traditional rivalries persisted, and some of the British believed that France still had territorial ambitions in the area. "We have engagements for a fortnight," wrote Jacques Arago to a friend, "and will you not be astonished that I, who have occasionally spoken of the English with little favour, should now be receiving their civilities and attentions? Today," he continued, "the word Englishman was never painful to his ear." According to the Sydney Gazette, Sydney was equally pleased with its visitors, describing the French officers as gentlemen with the most kind and polished manners. In this French picture of Government House at Parramatta, you can see on the left tiny figures who represent Louis and Rose arriving for their country visit to Lachlan Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth. The Uranie left Sydney on Christmas Day 1819, unintentionally taking with them 10 convicts who'd hidden themselves on board. From here, instead of a triumphant passage home to France, carrying a wealth of natural history specimens and scientific records, they were wrecked in the uninhabited Falkland Islands. Rose's account of this period is quite harrowing. In Jacques Arago's drawing of the shipwreck, you can see the makeshift shore camp. The beach is haphazardly littered with bundles and ropes and smaller boats that they've rescued, while the Uranie's fallen masts and rigging are caught in the shallows. Tents made of sailcloth and spars dot the dunes, while under a wintry sky, a sailor climbs a sandhill to shoot at the wheeling seabirds for food. Here's a scene from a different angle, drawn by Alphonse Pellion, when the camp was a little more established. Offshore is the shipwrecked Uranie, and further to right, a white distress signal is flying. Louis had become seriously ill, and Rose, while nursing him, worried what might happen to her if he died and the crew mutinied. However, after 2 cold months with no lives lost, the company were finally rescued by an American vessel, and when they arrived back in France, Louis was court-martialed for losing his ship. Rose died some 10 years later at 36, after nursing Louis through the 1832 cholera epidemic in Paris. Louis died at Saulce-sur-Rhône in 1842, still grief-stricken at losing Rose. After his death, Rose's remains were moved from Paris to join his in the family cemetery near the Rose de Freycinet. My main source for the book, of course, was Rose's journal, together with her surviving letters home. A handwritten journal delivered to her friend Caroline de Nantouil on Rose's return to France in 1820, was given back to the Freycinet family in 1913. An abridged version was published in Paris in 1927, and this was later translated into English in 1996. I found this English version rather bland at first reading, and it appears that it was passed through the hands of various male editors who, for various reasons, removed any passages that they considered too personal or indelicate, or likely to diminish the Freycinet family's reputation or that of any other public figures. Some of these alterations seem rather absurd today. Rose's reflections on the undesirability of being sold into a seraglio by pirates, and even a mention of the devil in a crossing the line ceremony, were censored. But on returning to the original sources, as you can see, while Rose's handwriting is very neat, her journal is quite difficult to read. But I'll stop here so we have time for some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne. That was truly fascinating. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to open it up to the audience if there are any questions, because we've got a little bit of time before we start the second part of the viewing. But first of all, I might ask Suzanne, what did Rose get up to when she returned? Were there any other great adventures? What kind of life did she have back in Paris?
It was rather sad, actually. Louis was absolutely obsessed with creating his account and various other documents, and so he was sort of away all day working. And I think she was quite lonely. She wrote a lot of letters to Louis's brother Henri's wife, who was a colonial governor. Henri was a colonial governor, and she wasn't very well, and she shared family news, but there's a very lonely tone to it. So It's quite sad, really.
This was a kind of one great adventure in life.
It
no children.
It was an anticlimax.
Yeah.
And of course she was devastated because while she didn't get pregnant during the voyage, which was fortunate, she seemed to be unable to be pregnant afterwards.
Right. Now, have we got anyone in the audience that has a question they'd like to ask Suzanne? Yes.
I have a question about, so she mustered as a boy, like disguised as a boy, but later on she was out as a woman. How long did that take? Was she discovered, or did she just come out on her own? Because if it was too close to port, I suppose she would have said that.
As soon as she was out of French territorial waters, she emerged from the cabin as the captain's wife, dressed elegantly as a woman, which must have surprised the crew somewhat. I think some of the officers might have guessed.
Yeah.
Even though there was the cleaned up English translation, has there been another English translation more accurate and honouring every word that she wrote? No. The English translation by Marc-Serge Rivière was taken from the published French version, and I'm hoping someone with better French than me will go back to the original handwritten version and transcribe every word untouched.
Yeah. The journal is now in the collection of the State Library of New South Wales. I think it's been there for about 10 years now. The actual physical journal they've purchased.
Yes, you can visit it and I'll show it to you.
And it has been digitised, so you can sort of flick through it online. But as you can see from this shot, it is tricky to read, and someone translating would probably need to see the original thing. And they've also in their collection now got the handwritten the handwritten versions of the letters that she wrote to her mother, which were probably transcribed by Louis. Is that the thing?
He made a copy, yes.
So the original letters
originals
are lost, but those transcriptions are also in the State Library. So there's an incredible amount of Freycinet material back in Australian collections.
How have we got it instead of the Freycinet family or somebody in France?
I think you probably know a bit more about the auction.
Well, most of the documents stayed in the Freycinet archive for several generations, and I think probably the father of the present Baron de Freycinet, who kindly commented on my family sections chapters, I think it was his father who started selling them at various auctions in tranches, and there'd always been some interest in Australia by various collectors. So a lot of them were scooped up by various philanthropic people.
So including Caroline Simpson. So all of the works we'll see tonight come from Caroline Simpson's collection. She purchased, I think, at 3 separate auctions, including an auction as late as 2002 at Christie's in London. So it was just before the year before her death. So it was probably some of the final pieces that she was collecting. And there were 2 other auctions, one in Melbourne, I think in about 94. So it seems like little blocks have been up for sale, and various institutions have managed to pick up bits and pieces as well. So the National Library have a few artworks, and I think the Library of Western Australia might have 1 or 2 as well that deal with Shark Bay. So a lot has come back. We also have on display in our library, we also have a copy of the 1927 French edition of Rose's journal when it was first published. And we have a copy of Arago's 1823. He published his own kind of account of the voyage as well. So they're both on display and in our collection, and they come from Caroline's personal collection too.
That's another fascinating story, because while Louis was alive, Arago didn't mention Rose in all his various publications about the voyage, because he was short of money when he got back to France, and then churned out, quite a lot of versions of the. But he is the only one that gives us a glimpse of Rose from a sort of a third-person perspective. And of course, because while Rose was going to balls and Government House, he was visiting the slave markets and going to brothels and generally behaving badly. So he has this very cynical and amused view. But he adored Rose. He thought he really admired her. And as he was a great womanizer, that was quite a tribute.
What exactly was the voyage for? What were they looking for? And how much did they know about what they would find?
Well, Baudin's voyage was a scientific expedition, and not only did he nearly kill Louis by sending him out to do stupidly dangerous things, Louis also thought he mucked up the scientific aim, so he wanted to do it again and do it properly, and also do a lot more cartography, because he did a lot of mapping. He in fact published. It's a long story, but Flinders was imprisoned in Mauritius, and so Louis managed to publish the first complete outline of Australia that was accurate and with Tasmania separate from the mainland, which was hard luck on Flinders because he'd done the same mapping, but he couldn't publish because he was in prison. So there was a bit of a rather awkward situation there. But yeah, Louis is mainly famous for completing the first entire map of Australia. And he brought back a huge amount of scientific material.
Is there any indication of what she did during the voyage? Does she talk about doing anything other than, like I ate oysters on the beach? Does she talk about any of the daily life of living on a ship?
Well, she wrote the journal, and the journal, the journal has entries almost every day. She sewed. She read about from Louis' library. She read up on all the places they were about to visit.
Played guitar a lot, didn't she?
Yes.
Was she practicing her guitar?
There's a wonderful scene where the officers, they had a little poop deck where Louis and Rose could take fresh air, and the officers used to sit there a little distance away while Louis, who had quite a good voice, would sing, and Louis and Rose would accompany him on the guitar. So this was sort of a rather nice, all these homesick officers with no women listening to, this music.
Does she talk about the crew at all?
She doesn't. She doesn't mention. Never even mentions any of the other officers by name, in case not wanting to cause gossip. But there's an interesting story that there was what was his name? Jean-Baptiste Rose was one of the crewmen, and the crew, I think, were quite intrigued by having Rose on board, but whenever Jean-Baptiste Rose, whenever she walked on the deck, they would retreat and give her room to, a bit of space. But if Jean-Baptiste Rose came out on deck, they would call out, "Rose! Rose!" and of course, the officers couldn't do anything about it because A, officially she wasn't there, and B, they were only calling out to their crewmates. So,
We might have one more. Yep.
What was lost when they shipwrecked at the Falklands Islands? Was much lost then on the Uranie?
The shipwreck happened very, very slowly. They hit an underwater pinnacle that hadn't been mapped and there was a hole in the ship, but they managed to sail to the end of the bay and beach the ship on a sandy beach, on a sort of soft surface. And it didn't break up for several weeks. So they were able to get almost everything that was important on shore. Although a lot of documents and illustrations were lost because they were under the water level by the time they were able to beach the ship. So anything underwater that was fragile. Rose said she lost a trunk of dresses and things like that, and some documents were lost. But it was amazing the amount of stuff they were able to rescue. In fact, Rose stayed on the beached ship in her quarters until it started to break up, and then she moved to a tent, a cold and damp tent on shore.
Right, folks, well that ends the first half. We're just going to move a little bit of equipment around, and then we'll have the opportunity to now view the collection, and there'll be a chance to chat as well to Suzanne and I as we go through and ask some questions. So just bear with us for 1 minute while we move a bit of furniture, and then I'll invite you over to have a look. Thank you.